Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Hello, 2021. Well, we're going to see an interesting phenomenon in 2021. You know, America's been exporting its inflation to China for 20 years, and now China's caught up to America. And now all that money printing that's been going on for 20, 25 years is going to show up as real inflation. That's right. The purchasing power of your fiat money is going to go down. Commodity prices, of course, are going to now enter a secular bull market, and Bitcoin is going to rip the roof off the sucker. All righty, Stacy.
Right, Max. Well, we have been gone for our Christmas vacation, and now it's Orthodox Christmas, by the way, for those in that part of the world outside of America. So, you know, we had a lot of stories happen. We saw that China, they're saying, a new report is saying that they're going to overtake the United States much faster than had previously been anticipated. We saw Goldman Sachs. They're saying that the commodities bull market is back, and you're going to see that ripping the face off the world's financial markets. And you see, of course, more stimulus checks going out in America and continuation of lockdowns. So we enter 2021 on this. And this is why, you know, Max Keiser's prediction about $28,000 Bitcoin by the end of the year came true. And that happened exactly as he had said back at the beginning of the year. So that happened. And I want to first look at, we'll look at that news about China, because I guess that's the most important, really. The Thucydides trap is that big, giant story overarching all economic stories. China to overtake U.S. as the world's biggest economy by 2028, report predicts. Center for Economics and Business Research says it expects this to happen half a decade sooner than it forecast a year ago. Douglas McWilliams, the CEBR's deputy chairman, said the big news in this forecast is the speed of growth of the Chinese economy. We expect it to become an upper income economy during the current 5-year plan period, which is 2020 to 2025, and we expect it to overtake the U.S. a full 5 years earlier than we did a year ago.
So everyone's purchasing power goes down in fiat money, but less so for the Chinese economy. So in 2021, all the fiat money starts to fall against commodities, against gold, and number one, against Bitcoin. But in China, the rate at which the purchasing power will erode will be less than anybody else. And so their economy, in comparison, will be growing. And this will be a hard pill for the U.S. and other countries to swallow. But they are the victims of their own ridiculous policies that exported all the jobs to China. And now the whirlwind will be reaped.
Yeah, most empires do end this way, as we have discussed many times over the past 10 years. The United States is no different, apparently, and they've willingly sent all of their manufacturing capacity and wealth creation capacity, therefore, to China. China's share of global GDP has increased from 3.6% in 2000 to 17.8% in 2019, and will continue to grow, the CEBR said. It would pass the per capita threshold of $12,536 to become a high-income country by 2023. Note, of course, that it was in 2000. That's when, you know, the Democrats had pushed, including Joe Biden, had pushed for China to join the WTO. They formally became a member. I think it was like just after 9/11 in 2001. So they were only 3.6% of global GDP. 20 years later, they're 17.8% or 17.9% of GDP. So they're booming. And you know, in a way, so like we had said at the end of the year of 2020, is that Joe Biden, you know, his son, I guess, has very close relationships with the Communist Party in China. So that might reduce the tensions of a Thucydides trap. You know, as a rising power displaces an old power, it tends to be very violent and conflict ridden. Something like 16 out of the last 18 situations like this have been marked by global violence. So with Hunter Biden and, you know, his dad in the White House, it might be better. But, you know, these are just the data points. And partly, as we said, it was obvious that China's manufacturing capacity is 100% to normal, like after the pandemic. It's been back to normal since like April or May. and the rest of the world is struggling to contain this virus. So it is kind of a post-World War II sort of situation, as we've said before.
Right. It's like they're the only economy standing after the global pandemic, similar to America after World War II. You know, we've been saying for years now, the reason why Americans have been oblivious to this is because although their jobs have been exported to China, the prices at stuff that they're buying at the Walmarts and the big box stores have been falling more rapidly than their wages. So they have the illusion of actually having the same or improved living standards because the price of clothes and electronics and things like that were quite extraordinarily cheap. But that pendulum is about to swing in the other direction now as all the dynamics that made that possible reverse. And suddenly the purchasing power of the dollar relative to other currencies will lose rapidly. And Americans going to have that definitely a downgrade in living standards that I don't think anyone's preparing them for.
Of course, another problem for the imperial citizens of America is that our media. So our media hyper-propagandizes us and fills us with fear and hate for each other, but people outside the world. So they leave you stupid. And this is an example. There's this guy called Zha. He himself is targeted as some, like, his Twitter handle is called by American media that he's like some sort of agent of the Chinese state because he's Chinese and I think he lives in America, but he travels all over the world. Anyway, he posted this tweet that, you know, if you had listened to alternative voices instead of just listening to CNN, what the understanding you might have had a long time ago. So here he says how it started, and that's a CNN headline from 2017. China's metro station in the middle of nowhere. Ha ha ha! What imbeciles these people are. And then how it's going. Well, that's today, and there's a huge city around that station. You know, as the previous article had pointed out, they have 5-year plans, right? So this is how they do it. They build the infrastructure first, the metro lines, the train lines, and then they build the city around it. Because this is a great technology, right? Like a lot of our cities in Europe or like Manhattan are built around ports and when everything was shipped, and you know, and cities were built on rivers because everybody traveled by boat. Now we travel in a different way. So they build like the equivalent of a river from a couple hundred years ago and then build the city around it. Yeah, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I think the problem with the media also, if you look at these league tables that track in various countries indices for wealth and healthcare and education, you'll find that America's average educational quotient, if you will, has been dropping pretty precipitously for a couple of decades now. And that certainly is reflected in the media. So when you see a story like that, and the average American media consumer doesn't understand that an infrastructure build of a subway stop would be the first step toward building a city, and that context is not provided, and it's just seen as a cartoon that should be laughed at without any context. It's sad, really, because to get the education standards back up in the U.S. would require a lot of money that now the U.S. won't have, particularly since the dollar is on the verge now of collapsing.
Okay, Hollywood is one of the biggest industries in America. Almost all stories for any drama go back to Aristotle. Since the days of Aristotle, we know that when you behave like that, when you speak like that with hubris, that is the beginning of your downfall. It's always like, we've known this for several thousand years. Like, it's never different this time. So as soon as you start mocking your competitor for how like backward or poor or whatever they are, like, you know, I'm sure they're like, okay, you just ignore us. We're just here making our dumb little subway station out in the middle of nowhere. So I just think it's like, you know, the CNN guys got to sneer and think that they were better than everybody else, and it maybe made them feel better when they, you know, went out for their cocktails that evening in Manhattan and giggled with their cohorts from MSNBC. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, like once those elites crumble, that's better. The ordinary American will live so much better. If Europe is any guide, the ordinary European lives way better now than they did when their countries were empires.
Right, and the story that you're describing there would be great for the Chinese equivalent of Hollywood to make a feature film about the U.S. and its crumbling empire in the early 21st century. And that film will make it to the U.S. someday, and there'll be English subtitles or dubbed into English, and Americans will be watching this, but paying through the nose for the app that'll now be owned by China.
And the other thing that's interesting, and it's partly, China's fault, they're not transparent like Western economies are. They don't give a whole bunch of details about what's actually going on. But you ought to have some brains to be able to look at the actual data, and you can't fake commodities, right? You can't just have you can't pretend it's all fine if there's a shortage of stuff, right? Well, Goldman Sachs says Curry predicts long-lasting bull market for virtually all commodities. The world is entering a long-lasting bull market for commodities, with even oil set to benefit as recent underinvestment, dollar weakness, government spending, and the energy transition boost demand across the board, Goldman Sachs' global head of commodities research, Jeffrey Curry, said. So he says that every single commodity market, with the exception of wheat, is in deficit today, and highlighted the example of oil, saying capital expenditure in the oil sector had fallen an unprecedented 40% in the first half of the year. He argued that even oil demand would be boosted by spending on the energy transition to a green energy grid.
Right. Well, this is where having the world reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, and the exorbitant privilege that comes with it goes in reverse. Because all commodities are priced in dollars. That's one of the outcomes of World War II was the U.S. dollar standard, and all commodities priced in dollars. And now that the dollar purchasing power will be shrinking, the U.S. purchasing of the commodities will be higher than anyone else in the world. And that will work to the detriment of the U.S. economy going forward. And it is a secular bull market in commodities we're getting ready to embark on. And it is largely due to the fall of the U.S. dollar, because all commodities are priced in dollars. So all those economies that are able to hedge against the dollar are going to be a lot better off than the U.S. that's based on the dollar.
And again, it goes back to that profound hubris on your mainstream media source of news content that are supposed to explain the world to you, where you'll see China's lying about their COVID numbers. It can't be real. They must be as much of a disaster as us. And yet the data shows somebody's using those commodities. They're building these cities like this, right? That's happening while the entirety of America, because they only get their media from the news, they get their news from the cable news. They think it's like that. They don't understand what is happening overseas. And, they'll have to learn, or they have to tune into Keiser Report. That's what I say.
All right, 2021, the greatest year ever for Bitcoin. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Professor Steve Keen. Steve Keen, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Good to be here, Max, and good to be out of 2020 as well. Thank God 2020 is now hindsight.
Well, speaking of 2020, Steve Keen, what happened? What were the big stories, in your view, of 2020, economically speaking?
Well, obviously, COVID is the biggest story of this year. We'll never change that. My take on it is that the big story is how badly the so-called liberal economies have coped with COVID and how well the so-called authoritarian ones have. So you particularly have China, which is where this thing began, has huge New Year's Eve parties on 2020 because they have got rid of it with only 90,000 cases. America, 20 million cases. So it's divided the world into two very fragmented bits, and that's, I think, the news for some time. There's a segment of the world dominated by China that is COVID-free, and there's a segment dominated by America, which is COVID-infested. And we'll see long-term consequences of that, I think.
Reminds me of World War II. America entered World War II uniquely positioned to be the winner of World War II, and sure enough, they won. And it became the American century as a result, because all the other economies in the world were in ruins. Here at COVID, it just so happens that China was uniquely positioned to do well with this type of global pandemic. They've emerged as now probably going to lead the 21st century. And those countries like the U.S. and Britain and others, they just were not prepared for something like this. They decided not to prepare. And let's move on. So the U.S. dollar turns 50 this year, and the IMF has just called for a new Bretton Woods. Now, a year ago or so, Mark Carney, while head of the Bank of England, said the U.S. dollar was no longer fit to serve as the reserve currency. So are we going to start to see the dollar on its 50-year anniversary start to go the way of every single fiat money in history, and that is to zero?
No, it's not. It's not going to zero as a fiat currency, Max. It's going to zero as the international currency, and it should always have been a zero as the international currency. That was probably the biggest egotistically driven tactical mistake maybe in America's history. It's had a few. But to overrule Keynes and have the American dollar used for international currency rather than Keynes's idea of a created currency called a bancor, which all countries would have needed to buy for international trade, that would have meant you could have had a still vibrant American manufacturing sector. You wouldn't have had the massive imbalances. You wouldn't have the massive growth in the power of the financial sector. So it's not ceasing to be a fiat currency. It'll still be that, but it'll stop being an overstretched fiat currency pretending to be an international one. I don't think it's going to happen this year. It might happen in 10. Be a damn good thing when it does, but it'll still be the fiat currency of America.
You bring up a good point there. So the dollar became world reserve currency during really the first Bretton Woods, and Keynes argued for the bancor, which have been basically a global settlement currency to work. And this new Bretton Woods, it seems like they want to bring back the equivalent of the bancor. They want to bring back maybe a global digital central bank digital currency to act as the bancor. So are they going, do you think that's what the game plan will be? They'll be like, you know what, Lord Keynes was right. Let's go back and do this global settlement layer.
I mean, I know the Chinese, over the previous Chinese governor of the central bank had read Keynes on that front and cited the proposal. So yes, I think that wouldn't be what they're saying around the table, but that's those who know their history know that's what they're doing. And it's a similar sort of idea. Keynes wanted the number of bancor distributed on the basis of the size of countries' GDPs. And that's the same idea. If you have a basket of currencies backing it, it's almost equivalent to the same idea. So the question is whether they understand how they need to increase it over time. I've got a feeling some neoclassical economists there will manage to stuff it up, but it is fundamentally a good idea.
Right. Another Keynesian idea would be that when the economy is slowing down, you can go into debt, and then when the economy is picking up again, you pay down the debt. But what we've seen over the past few decades is if the economy is slowing down, you go into debt. If the economy is speeding up, you go into more debt. There's never been any less debt. What's the global picture on debt, Steve? This is like one of your specialties. Last I saw, the global debt is over 300% debt to GDP. My numbers are not going to be as accurate as your numbers. What is the global debt situation right now, Steve?
The thing we have to do, and this is essential, is what modern monetary theory is around, is there's a fundamental difference between private debt and government debt. In private debt, a private non-bank owes money to a private bank. In the government's case, the government owes money to the government. And you don't have the same limitations in paying back your bank if you happen to own it. So that is the fundamental underlying piece of why you've got to separate the two. The real danger is the level of private debt we'll let ourselves get into. I can't give an aggregate figure I could have with a few minutes' notice, but not live. The American situation, probably the best one to talk about, and that started at 40% of GDP after the Second World War, rose to 170% at the peak of the financial crisis, and has fallen to 150% and was fluttering along at that level, which is 3 times the level that enabled you to have the golden age of capitalism. And that's the anchor, that's the chain around the ankles of the global economy, too much private debt. So my hope is we might get some sort of movement to wipe out that private debt using the government's capacity to create money in what I call a modern debt jubilee. I would never have thought they had a hope in hell of happening, but after COVID, maybe some things will be on the table. But that's the real danger. Too much private debt, a private sector that doesn't want to spend because it's got too much debt to service, slow circulation of money, and sluggish economies.
Right. Now, talking difference, private debt, public debt. But when you see a lot of private debt, let's say in the banking sector, and then they go bust, and then the government bails them out without any conditions, an unconditional bailout, as we've seen now. And when banks make mistakes like on Wall Street and they get caught doing illegal things, then they only have to pay a few pennies on the dollar in fines of the money that they stole. Right? Is there any real difference between private and public debt? Because it all ends up being bailed out by the government anyway. It's all public debt.
That's a very good, very cynical, very good point. The cynicism is well justified because that shouldn't happen. What happens when a bank fails is its depositors should be safe, which is the whole idea of depositor insurance, but the asset holders get wiped out. And as our good mate Michael Hudson's put it, the government's bailed out Wall Street rather than the main street. It's kept the parasite alive rather than the host. So there's lots of very bad behaviour in that sense, and it shouldn't be the case. The liability should be carried by the state so that people don't lose their deposit accounts, but the asset holders should go bust.
So you end up now with a global debt situation and an attempt to reimpose some kind of equilibrium around the world. A word I know you have a lot to say about the word equilibrium.
I do indeed, mate.
Let me just use it in this context. There's some kind of equilibrium matching up debts with, presumably they'll look at something like gold reserves to see if which country has gold that they can back up this new christening of the global economy. And would it work?
You don't need gold. The main debts that are problematic are countries like Argentina that owe American dollars. They're the ones that you've got the real problems with. Most countries in the world owe debt in their own currency. So it's not that's not the one that's not the thing that's holding us back. It's the private debt. And frankly, I'd like to see what we call government debt increase to be able to reduce the level of private debt and take away the amount of credit-based money and have more fiat-based money in the economy. Our problems have come from letting the private banks create too much money for Ponzi schemes, which is what they've been doing for the last 30 years. And what the central banks have been doing is bailing them out from those Ponzi schemes and amplifying the behaviour right from the days of Greenspan and the Greenspan put back in 87. So there's a lot wrong with the system, but let's start focusing on where it went wrong, and that's mainstream economists not understanding private debt.
All right, and you mentioned Argentina there. Of course, they issued a 100-year bond just a couple of years ago and immediately dropped 40-50%. And they seem to be a recidivist defaulter on their debt. It's almost de rigueur. It's expected that Argentina will default every couple of years on their debt. And you mentioned that, of course, they've got U.S. dollar-based debt, which is a trick we saw during the Mexican peso crisis back, a while back. How do these countries, why do they issue debt in dollars anyway? Why do they do that?
Well, mainly because people won't accept their own currency, Max. I mean, would you buy Turkish bonds right now?
Right, but if they do one in the dollar-based and it's going to drop 50 or 60% anyway, net, I'm in the same place I started. Regardless of what currency it is. Fiat money is, you seem to be somewhat of positive and constructive on the idea that a fiat money standard can work on some basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a capacity to have an elastic money supply, which can help for things like funding innovation. If you've got to save up pennies to pay for innovations, often they won't happen. Banks don't do a perfect job by incredible stretch of imagination, but that capacity to have an elastic financial system is partly will let you have things like railway booms, internet booms, and so on. They can be a catastrophe in the slump that follows them, but they leave a huge amount of physical infrastructure behind that we later benefit from. So it's not a straightforward story.
All right, let's move on, change gears here. You're based in Thailand. You're working on a plan to address climate issues. We've got about a minute and a half. Tell us more about this, Steve. Sounds exciting.
Well, having looked at what economists have done on what they call carbon pricing, it's too little too late. Carbon pricing won't work. So my suggestion is carbon rationing instead. The idea is central banks, rather than issuing money as digital currency, would issue universal carbon credits as a supplementary currency. Everything would be priced in both dollars and UCCs. You and I would get we'd all get the average for the country. And that is only 2% of the population would actually be using more than the average of universal carbon credit. So that 2% would run out of their UCCs pretty rapidly and have to buy them off the 98% of us who don't run out of them. It'd be a strong way of reducing the level of carbon generation. It'd put incredible incentives to go for decarbonised technology by the wealthy, and it would redistribute wealth and income from the wealthy to the poor. So it's what I'd call a Robin Hood currency, and therefore has Buckley's chance of actually happening.
Is there a comparison to be made between rationing carbon credits and rationing fiat money?
No, there isn't. You know how much we've got a global carbon budget. We know what that is. If we exceed it, catastrophe follows. That's very different to a fiat currency, which is elastic and rubbery. Can cause catastrophes, but it doesn't wipe out planetary systems as we're doing with carbon.
Okay, Steve Keen, thanks so much. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you indeed, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser, I'd like to thank our guest, Steve Keen. Now, you can find Steve Keen on patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. Until next time, bye, y'all.